Greetings, fellow earthlings, gentle readers, reading foundations today with Ross Finlayson, myself, this August 27, 2026. This will be the 50th or so episode of Reading Foundations, each about an hour. And the course is basically after Logos 2000, which is after A Moment in Motion, which is after Descriptive Differential Dynamics, these 50-plus hour video essays of a sort, oral manuscripts, say, unscripted, extemporaneous, improvised in a sense, yet grounded in a study and research and foundations. It's a lifelong endeavor of experience and experiment and study and research and the learning and these kinds of things. So in Logos 2000, it kind of came to arrive at a philosophical exposition. So the philosophical vis-a-vis the expository sort of essay is that the expository essay sort of begins with what it intends to say and then lays it all out. Whereas the philosophical essay sort of begins picking up the pieces and then arriving at somewhere. So these being both expository and philosophical sorts of essays, has it that the Logos 2000 arrived at A theory, which for me was already in effect. The axiomless natural deduction, and after the first axiom, if there were any, being inverse, and these sorts of things, of a thorough sort of ongoing account of the extraordinary after studying continuity and infinity for its rigorous formalism and all the accounts of its paradox-free reason that can be arrived at. So after Moment of Motion kind of came up with World's Turn, and so this basically makes for the potentialistic setting of mechanics and the formal unlinearness of it, and why that is so, and that there's room in the theory and room under the definition for it to be so. Then the Descriptive Differential Dynamics was more of a second course after a mathematics degree. Here, just a plain old bachelor's degree in mathematics, with what that entails these days, or as it were, advanced calculus, differential equations, numerical methods, formal methods, topology, abstract algebra, and other sorts courses, getting into the requirements that everybody's expected to know when entering mathematical or engineering discipline that's mathematical. Then the Descriptive Differential Dynamics was about taking a fresh look at what I call an original perspective about the origin, and also kind of that it's underserved in the accounts of the developments, about the totally positive or the semi-infinite, or here the identity dimension, and the diagrams that can be made for spaces of numbers and the structures that are numbers for number theory and geometry, as being about here arithmetic and geometry, and then algebra is about them, and then the analysis with both the integral equations and the differential equations, and the integral equations sort of first, instead of the usual account that the differential equations are first. It's easier to compute a slope, a tangent, a differential, a derivative of a line, a function, a curve, than it is to figure out what's underneath that. But that what's underneath that, or what it is more so the account of the integration of it, the measure of things. And so that account of Descriptive Differential Dynamics explored the concepts as the grab bag toolkit of differential analysis of symmetries, submersions, and sheaves, or is about the account that goes into groups in the algebra setting, or the differential geometry setting, which is again a sort of a reductionism as it's arrived at, or the topological setting, which is kind of properly enough for the sheaves after the differential geometries, submersions and immersions, and the symmetries and invariant theory of usual sorts, finite closed algebras, and then restricted settings, the partial differential geometry. And then for topology as being open, the definitions of function and topology are among the most fluid found in mathematics. as with regards to what a topology is, and with regards to what a continuous topology is, that it's its own initial and final topology. For an actual definition of a continuous domain, which already was in effect, the descriptive differential dynamics arrived at a couple of different things with regards to up to Zeno's swath, and trying to figure out the sinusoidal, the sigmoidal, and the exponential all living in a box together, and how that's just the diagonal. And then with regards to the identity dimension being the envelope of the integral equations, kind of like a singularity, but the envelope that contains them, the boundary of the linear fractional equation, D'Alembert's equation, and after Clairaut's equations, these linear equations, the integral equations rather, they're so fundamental and primitive in all the accounts of an education into analysis, which starts with integral equations and their plane curves, instead of differential equations in their systems of solutions. As with regards to the existence and uniqueness then of solutions, and well-posedness according to Hadamard, and all these sorts of accounts of the differ integro and integro differ. That then the identity dimension became its own sort of thing. And also the x squared plus minus 1 bit, and the grind, as that could be, with regards to things like Pythagorean triples, or n-lateralometry. It's like trigonometry, except it also works for squares, pentagons, hexagons, and so on, all the regular polygons, providing an entirely kind of a different way of starting and arriving at the same things, but then carrying out how it goes into a wider setting. So many of the usual accounts of systems of equalities and systems of inequalities were explored there. And with regards to existence uniqueness theorems and uniqueness and distinctness results, when what were made reductionisms is after stipulations or assumptions, the implicits have so equipped a reformulation that makes for the distinctness results instead of uniqueness results. And these independence results that mathematics has, since forever in these talks there are always three continuous domains, which I named long ago, the line reals, field reals, and signal reals. Different models of objects in something like a set theory, and its descriptive set theory is account, so that it arrives at being that there are these analytical bridges, a non-Cartesian function, so that the Pythagoreans, for whom everything is rational, and it's the only way to start and get there, and the Cantorians, for whom everything is transcendental and there's no way down, can get along that somehow in the middle, that there's a meeting in the middle, that otherwise they're just kind of glaring at each other on either side of the boat in paradise that they're on, trying to figure out if they're going to get tossed off or toss each other off. The Pythagorean account of the almost all rational, and the Cantorian account of the almost all transcendental, these ways. The continuous domains, then, three of them, and the accounts of the results about how one of them's countable, and then the signal reals kind of come down from a higher cardinal than the usually given cardinal of the complete ordered field, C, the cardinal that's the same as that of 2 to the aleph 0, and cardinal exponentiation, and these sorts of accounts. And that there's the existence given and shown that after the equivalency function, the natural unit equivalency function falls out of the arguments otherwise for uncountability as uncontradicted. And then that account of ubiquitous ordinals makes for an ordering theory, just or a lot like Cohen's model forcing makes for so the independence of CH instead of the contrariness or the contradictions of the continuum hypothesis. That ubiquitous ordinals makes for the power result, much like this natural unit equivalency function makes for the otherwise number-theoretic results for uncountability, that it falls out of them uncontradicted. And then, of course, that it's just an ancient consideration. Cavalari's indivisibles, Leibniz's raw differentials themselves, infinitesimals, Xenocrates' real numbers, Aristotle's, at least one of Aristotle's account of real numbers, what makes for the continuum, a linear continuum, that defining what real numbers is or are in their collective and aggregate sort of senses. That the line reals, field reals, and signal reals, thusly, are part of the definition of objects of mathematics, of continuous domains with extent, density, completeness, and measure, thus living on the integer lattice and living in the entire space of all the real numbers in the infinite dimensional. As for geometry, from a point in all the space. that these are considered between the integer continuum, as like Duns Scotus or Spinoza. The infinity is in, it's actual. They've also had that idea since forever, since Ananta, when the spiral was the idea of mathematics itself instead of infinity, usually the idea being given to it. For continuity. And then the long line continuums, like, well, algebraically, we've got all the expressions and it's more than what there could be of points on a line. So somehow it is also what is to make for this individuation of points on the line, the individua of a continuum, individuation of points on a line, the degenerate or the measurable regions, and then how it makes all together for something like the line rails that it's measurable, and then getting into the quasi-invariant doubling spaces and doubling measures and having spaces and having measures, that the polydimensional and pan-dimensional aspects of these points is that a point by itself has got no sides, it's got no width, it's got no length, it's got no breadth, it's got no depth, it's a point. But from all the different angles that point to it from each of these, that can the inward projection of these things, ascribe to equip it with that in one dimension, then Vitali, the geometer, already in the age of the symbolic and the set theoretical, makes for an example that then was just called, well, that's got to be non-measurable, because it would be, it's the doubling space and doubling measure. That's the same account since Zeno of moving rows, or the graduation course, or wind sprinters, I call it, kind of beyond the runners and the Achilles and the tortoise and the stadium and the tracks, the accounts of the doubling spaces and doubling measures, and for like the pi ratio space and these sorts of accounts from the yin-yang ad infinitum, that takes a circle and notices that its diameter and its circumference have a constant ratio, it's pi, and then as that's flattened down to infinitely many circles on the line, that it maintains both that ratio according to the diameter and the sum of the circumferences, but that goes to a flat line of 0, and so in the infinite limit, at the end, it's a pi ratio space, kind of like these having spaces and having measures, doubling spaces and doubling measures, that is a result of fates, opuses, acts, or works on these making of distinctions of points, like quantizing, that's an act of a sort, helping to explain that in the real mathematical objects, these are always like so, and then giving a reason why so many times in physics there are found quantities that are essentially spurious in the micro and in the Planck scale, or is about the adiabatic in the accounts of flow of aggregate particles, spurious twos or spurious 1/2 factors that are put in and said, well, it wouldn't matter because they'd be negligible anyways, and besides, this is the only way it adds up after the fact. And similarly for 8 pi and usual counts of the gravitational field equations, Planck's numbers, and everywhere else where that shows up. And with regards to its usual account of a circle, an area, and a sphere, and area, that these are then reasons why the overall account of mathematics has these underneath and first, primary in the theory, this continuity and infinity, then to make otherwise that the accounts that would leverage and teeter it on out way up high in the ivory tower are doomed to tip over, that these are not. So then after that, then the moment in motion got a lot into trying to understand how momentum gets lost in the wash vis-a-vis inertia, and that it's an inertial system instead of, Einstein never calls relativity, its mechanics, a system of momentum. It calls it an inertial system. And then the idea that inertia, or that momentum is conserved, is also that it's immediately lost every time we look, and as soon as it's introduced the unlinear, or here that's basically framed as the kinetic separately from the kinematic, that the kinetic has a vector addition, and the kinematic has the folding and back and forth, and where momentum gets lost in the wash, whereas otherwise it still kind of maintains the overall energy in the thing. The energy is still conserved, but momentum is lost in the wash. And then for the account of spinning bodies, since the laws of mechanics usually given, like Newton's laws, rest, rest, motion, motion, equal opposite, perfect inelastic collisions, has no account made of spinning bodies at all. And so for the real account of space contraction, and as soon as gyroscopic terms begin to evince themselves, and definitely in the third order and beyond, heft is given as a real physical quantity after weight and for mass, that the angular momentum is kind of incorporated in that as kinetic term. And it's beyond what's explained by the Magnus effect or Coriolis effect with regards to projectiles that spin or balls that spin or athletes that wind and unwind, or the exceptional triple jumper, or the basketball air, or even for accounts like the spinning ice skater or the balaton. These are beyond otherwise explained effects, but they're natural, and thusly to make them real and keep them natural and keep them in the theory involves, for moment and motion, it was explored pretty thoroughly why that's so. Then the Logos 2000, it was a lot about the philosophical aspects of truth, and then the idealistic tradition, the analytical traditions, and then also exploring and touching upon all these kinds of things as going along. And then arriving at the A theory. That now in this reading foundations bit, it's been exploring a lot of the scientific things a bit more thoroughly, since the accounts like the light theory and the color theory and the Lorentzians and the Schroedingerians. And so these are ideas that I put together for at least some years, and usually a while before I'd mention it here or something like that. I'll already have written dozens or hundreds of pages about them. And so these days it's coming back around that physics in its crises has kind of run out other things to like add more dimensions or make something else imaginary, and so it is getting back to these thinkers, their theories like Fadio and Lesage for gravity, and Fitzgerald for relativity, and as to why then for Fresnel and light, and many accounts of the existing great theoreticians that they already have them, and then finding out how to and where to fit them in the formalism and show that they fit in the data. Like, for example, heft lives and is known to exist because it's not explained by any other theory. It's more than an effect, it's an anomaly. And so these sorts of things are given a case that somehow they must add up to be measured, to be integrable, to be successful in a sense, an overall sort of account of the theory. So then his reading foundations has also been about language a bit more. That's covered in the Logos 2000, of course, because it's a discourse, the Discorso Logos, and it's about man or humanity and the human condition, and with regards to the notions of machine and the animal and the mind, that it's considered that most everyone in their philosophical maturity and development has encountered at least one of the two stages, and probably both in their considerations. And one is where, and it's called objectivism, and this begins one of the things that's kind of confiscated from otherwise the surrounds, because somebody has come up and started using this term objectivism for like their selfishness or something like that. But what it means is when you have a sense of self, and it is like in the theory, I cannot disprove that behind my eyeballs that is me, but everything else is just a figment of imagination. Or the thought experiment is like, well, if there's no dinosaurs today, but it's like, what if a higher power just invented the universe up to the state of the instant, including all the memories, and just populated it, and on it went. So objectivism is one of these things. And then the idea is that then the universe is a figment, a film, insubstantial. And then another one of these ideas is kind of the opposite. It's like, the world is real, I'm a figment. And so this is kind of part of the intersubjective account, that's subjectivity, and the notion of equating and realizing these things and addressing the existentialism and the nihilism and back and forth of those, since the Atman and Brahman of the Vedas, so since prehistory, since before any written traditions remaining at all, the accounts of perspective and projection, or like so for the intersubjective about the interobjective. Because while at the same time everybody's different, everybody's an individual, each is an individual, and they have any number of commonalities. And then the idea is that the psychology and philosophies are each unique and thus subjective to each other, intersubjective, yet as well a piece objective to each. And so anybody who's ever bothered to establish or simply found personal reflection at all has arrived at these as part of their philosophical precepts, that it's an account and of the subjective and objective, and they reflect on each other and these kinds of things. So that's for then explaining for the accounts of phenomenology and these sorts of things. That here there's equipped the noumenon, the mental senses, an object sense, a word sense, a time sense, a number sense, and a sense of the continuum, so that for all the thinkers since antiquity, like Epicurus and Kant and Philo and Schopenhauer, or the logicist positivists and the Carnap school, and all these things that would come and arrive today for the kind of the postmodern, post-analytic, post-truth accounts, that instead it's figured that they were just missing the entire time, kind of just the notion to say is that, well, that still is maintained, so we must make a restructuralist account of this destructural account that also must be made about the paleoclassical and the postmodern, that is again a structural realism, because otherwise it's not a theory of everything or a theory of anything, it's a theory of nothing. And so here the theory of nothing itself is also the same void for the universal type of thing, that if there is no void type, it's always into the void, it springs from the void into the void, the same as the universal, this dually self-infraconsistent. So having that as all one thing can help a lot, because it makes for both the stronger logicist positivism, and that it's science, not empiricism, which is a totally fair and commonsensical account of this is what I know and this is how I can make decisions or compromises, and without getting into the entire fundamental question of metaphysics, which anybody who gets into mathematical and logical foundations must, because otherwise it's just axioms, and somebody else has different ones. Then has this wider, fuller dialectic then is considered fair and conscientious and fulfilling and true, say. That there is one at all. Not that as an intersubjective observer I have it, but I can describe everything that it must be in these terms. And then that's pretty satisfying when all the requirements and desiderata are kind of elaborated to be contemplated and upon which to be deliberated on their own terms, all one theory. So the reading foundations has come up with Thea theory then. It's just a little bit more spelled out and reified, and about the paradoxes of induction and identity and equality and continuity and infinity, that kind of covering most of what are called the logical and mathematical paradoxes. That there are none, since the Comenius language of Johann Comenius, if that's his name, who was a great educator for universal public education, and also had in his writings these accounts of the eternal basic text, or these kinds of things. That then leads into the book today, or what I'll be looking at for a while first, of Nietzsche. So Friedrich Nietzsche has an interesting name to spell, Nietzsche, Nietzsche, or Nietzsche. And so he was of a time when, after Schopenhauer and for Kant, and then the logicist scientism and logicist positivism, then he's and is considered here from the talks of like the cyclic metaphysic in Logos 2000 of being an anti-Plato. So Plato's like, I got ideals, I got their truths, and we discover them. And then at that point in time, that was split away. It was sundered and cut adrift. And so Nietzsche is exploring and then suffering in a sense, or just being strident in his skeptical criticism of the absence of the teleological attachment for an ontological commitment. And so teleology is just an account of purpose and time and causality, and ontology is the hierarchical stratification of type and category to make for effectual statements of knowledge and for a belief. Then an ontological commitment is like, that's what I believe. Vis-a-vis is like, that was what must be true, the teleology. And then the theology is a separate account, kind of beyond teleology, as that there's a higher power, and then whether that's the supreme truth and omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent, those being separate accounts of affirmative and negative accounts of the supernatural. Theology being then a kind of intersubjective thinking and feeling beings relation to that sort of thing. Then Nietzsche was kind of the madman. So here I kind of categorize these anti-Platos for their contributions and their role as Heidegger, the anxious angst, kind of reading the classics mostly, and then using his knowledge of the classics and ancient Greek to write in German in the 20s and in the through the 1940s in the continental setting about the angst and the anxiousness or anxiety, the fear that he constantly played over, vis-a-vis his accounts earlier of exploring the existential and the nihilistic, as after Derrida and Searle, and then vis-a-vis Sartre, who's been read here, with regards to Hegel's account of this, that besides being kind of a neo-Hegelian and neo-Nietzschean, Heidegger, that those aren't being a Hegelian or a Nietzschean. The Nietzsche's got to be read on his own account. So then there's Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein, very popular among philosophical circles, who started with the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus and then just kind of arrived at it and was like, and this is as far as I'm willing to give an ontological commitment to otherwise these idealisms that I just spouted. The Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, which is a Platonistic account, and then with a sort of tendered reserve, to then being that Wittgenstein is just kind of a hothead and said, you can't believe it's out there. And so the brown and the blue books, getting into those a little bit, if not having really kind of read those word for word, has that at some point in time they just stop saying much, except that Wittgenstein will gladly take you in as a confidant that you don't know, and that you can't trust him either. And that's kind of what he says. And so Wittgenstein is considered kind of a reactionary and plainly just on his own account then can be considered conscientious as a postmodern sort of critic, with more of the disfigurist account. And so like the other day I was watching an essay, a lecture on post-structuralism and postmodernism in critique. And so at one point in time, as I was watching that, the lecturer said something like, well, of course, destructural criticism is subject to its own account, and to be structural again, and you can take it or leave it, but it can always bring itself back together, the structure. And so for something like that, then, and after J. Hillis Miller, or some of the accounts of readings, like the deconstructive account in the philosophical foreground, those lectures from a few years ago, that's considered satisfactory with regards to the technical and the techno-analytic aspects, both of these sorts of deliberations. So Wittgenstein can be seen as sort of a popular writer, but he doesn't really say much overall. is how I'd put it. And although the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus is a very excellent account of somebody who's schooled and demonstrates a good eye on what would have to be the truth of the matters, than having this rejection and reaction and so on, but not a refutation, say, of the ideals in these senses. So Heidegger, and then Wittgenstein, and then there's Nietzsche. And so Nietzsche, as was mentioned, is exploring this nihilism after what was the existentialism, and then for like the void and universal. And here it's figured that they come back together. And he would have read as from Hegel, and Hegel's considered a giant, and Aristotle's considered a giant, and Kant's considered a giant, and Plato's considered a giant. And then, and among many others who each have particular unique things they've said, or represent schools or usual ways of talking and thinking about things. So that Nietzsche kind of has his own account of novelty and his originality in a sense. And he's kind of given the burden of carrying stuff like the rejection of the absence of deity, or God is dead, is what Nietzsche said, compared to Sartre's there is no God. These considered very inflammatory statements to those whose belief simply is, fair enough, first, that a monotheistic highest power is unfalsifiable, and so it's not for science or logicist positivism to say. And then that agnosticism is thusly the reasoner's course, what it could so be. That then trying to fill this in is that many then took some particular signposts of what Nietzsche said, exploring the account of existentialism, nihilism, and he basically has what's called the will to power and the Übermensch, or Superman. The idea is like, well, the highest power and all the shelter and the gift and the providence and the role that it gave us, purpose, is gone. So now man himself will fill that role, will expand to fill that role. And so it then gets into, in his various accounts, of whether they're the more technical or the more literary, because kind of like Umberto Eco, he's got technical accounts that are more so, and then the literary accounts, which are less so, but in parable and in allegory and these sorts of things. That besides stuff like thus spake Zarathustra about the parable and so on, and about himself, and then I'd have to recall better what it was like the main paper where the Superman or Übermensch is introduced, and what that means for will to power and these kinds of things. That then neo-Nietzscheans took these during the course of like 20th century conflict and so on, as saying that it's like these are the reasons why then this is within our grasp to take. So kind of like Marx is a neo-Hegelian. He basically takes what is Hegel's account of logic and reason, and thus for judgment and the critical, and then tries to explain that in terms that don't apply, but just saying it's like, obviously this is purely rational, so now you must agree. Similarly, the neo-Nietzscheans basically took from Nietzsche what was supposed to be an account of self-actualization into account of the relations then that Marx's communism and Heidegger and the Nietzscheans and so on are fascists. Either of which are basically radical progressives of the usurpatory sort, generally enough, and for they're not considered meritocratic, civil, individual, egalitarian, civil libertarianisms, but reflect all kinds of issues or problems with regards to governance, regulation, authority, control, and power, and usually enough the amassing of resources or wealth. So the system here of, as Aristotle put it, of a democracy is the rule of law, and that it's almost universally a representative democracy where everybody has a vote. And then with regards to that being kind of considered the Athenian, and later the representative democracy, and then a constitutional democracy where particularly then some laws are paramount vis-a-vis usual accounts of who knows, who cares, and who pays, of the pragmatic sorts of the juridical, these sorts of reasonings, vis-a-vis that it's considered civilization, and the accounts of power struggles and the like are not so. So Nietzsche was stolen, and Hegel was stolen, and you kind of have to study for philosophy's and technical philosophy's sake Nietzsche himself and Hegel himself, not necessarily, not even what I say about it, although I consider myself a fair Hegelian and fair Nietzschean about these things. That thusly the recourse to reason is unhindered by these attachments to tragedy, human suffering, and the human condition, or promises of utopia and the like. That's the way it is. So Nietzsche can be read as a great sort of anti-Plato, and particularly kind of the premier sort of anti-Plato, because then he's exploring these things. He happens to stop along the way at all these different things with regards to ideals, and helps pick them up and turn them over. So you can point at Heidegger as helping, saying it's like, well, we always got the knack about, we're always turning things over. I'm in a clearing, I'm in a field. I'm at once free from angst and anxiety and fear, which wasn't very often for Heidegger. Otherwise, just reading as like, I'm reading Parmenides this way, and Parmenides reading Parmenides that other way. And then he's got a dialectic, and I'll say what it is, like I didn't already read Hegel, and Hegel told me what it was. And these kinds of things, or with regards to these accounts. And Wittgenstein, just kind of stomping off hot-headed and daring anybody to disagree. Then Nietzsche explores a lot of these different concepts, like the eternal basic text. So that's like the communist language here, is this eternal basic text. And Quine mentions this. And then with regards to like the cosmic complement and these sorts of accounts. That this book is on Nietzsche. It's a Nietzsche kind of reader. What is this? Nietzsche and the Promise of Philosophy by Wayne Klein, K-L-E-I-N. Wayne, W-A-Y-N-E, Klein, K-L-E-I-N. A volume in the SUNY State University of New York, series in contemporary continental philosophy. And this book has been looked at here before. So this box has been put away here in one of the episodes back in Logos 2000 probably, or somewhere it was. There have been various times where there are still books to be read that are entirely unread, whereas this has been gone through before. But today, with regards to this reading foundations, it's an account of Nietzsche. And I have somewhere in my collection like the Nietzsche-Register. So the Nietzsche-Register is a book in German, and what it is it's a paperback book. It's about 100 years old. And what's in it is a bibliography of all these works that ever cited Nietzsche. And there's thousands and thousands of them. So his citation impact in philosophy is very, very huge, Nietzsche. And so the Nietzsche-Register is one of these books that I found in an antiquarian book fair, and it's just an example of something you can find a reference to it, if not necessarily its contents, on the internet. And then get an idea of all the people who went to take these ideas of Nietzsche and interpret them and through their own lenses in these sorts of accounts. And so one of the key things about that dimension is the will to power. And this is basically Nietzsche's will to persevere, will to maintain, will to continue, will to go on when everything else falls off and falls around. So people interpret that as the will to power then as like to grasp, to obtain something. And it's not necessarily so. But what it is that it's just kind of his survival instinct, and basically that in his desperation, because he was kind of crazed by these accounts of the reasoning, and to the point where the madman is one of his characters, about and that relating to the absent teleological purpose in his life, in a sense. So in the accounts of will to power, there are others, also psychological, other accounts of that today to consider. There's for like happiness, there's self-actualization, and other accounts of entirely different accounts of psychology. And what is besides the pleasure principle, or pain and pleasure, the accounts of hope and fear, then what makes for the accounts of why these the wills and the free will is just that there are at least three different kinds, basically, of will that each are as of individuals' wills in a society, and then with regards to how those things are almost universally with respect to reciprocity and the golden rules, silver rules sometimes, but four and more golden rules from the East and the West. These are the same, and it's said various in many ways. Then that then was just usually given the idea of that the Übermensch and the Superman and the will to power are kind of like the most abused of these, kind of like the Hegelianism, the dialectic by Marx and so on. And Marx, and also what surprised me a little bit was the guy who wrote the Little Red Book, or Mao Zedong, Mao in China. China was also a student of Hegel and Marx, and so the Little Red Book is like it's like a page and a half of stuff that good citizens do in that time and age. I mean, it's not much bigger than a pack of cigarettes. It's basically not much bigger than that. But Mao actually wrote a bunch of logic, and so there could be something to be gained from Mao as what's, or if it was a panel of his men as ghostwriters, who then claim to write to his authority and these sorts of things. These would be Marx and then Lenin later, but Marx is a student of Hegel, and attempting to use that authority for reason's sake as authority for his political ideology. That here is just kind of left on the side, kind of like religious ideologies. It's a free country. There's freedom of religion. Political ideologies. It's a free country. You can have your own ideologies and these sorts of things. That's considered the easiest account for all the experiments in democracy that the world has seen. For the otherwise, people will entirely reject anything else than an egalitarian sort of account. Then with Hegel, then having been kind of stolen, I'll put it, but usurped or just used, exploited. And then Nietzsche was as well, and so it's to be said then that it's not necessarily for that to be the case, and so we can confiscate from these thinkers what they might have made as true and apropos for the philosophy of a structural realism, while at the same time taking what matters of rhetoric, or the ethos and pathos, and leaving them on their own accounts with regards to the human condition, which of course is important with regards to things like the Frankfurt School, or Jean-Francois Lyotard, Lyotard, or accounts of philosophers of the 20th century that would intend to consider the changes and the things and these sorts of things. And as for like modern philosophers about like AI consciousness or Bostrom and the like, and these sorts of thinkers relating about the human condition and thinking and feeling beings, what then it means for systems of governance and so on, when Like they're inversions of the economies of scale in proportion, like when there's a Malthusian dilemma and everything runs out and the cost goes to infinity. Or when there's been Moore's law for 40 years and all of a sudden the costs of computing has gone to zero. But they thusly take resources that are like infinity to the rest of the regular world of supply and demand. For simple ideas like Adam Smith's invisible hand and Adam Smith's obvious thumb on the scales, for this Smith-Samuelson free market utility function, and X size on data centers and X size on RAM, and these sorts of accounts, and that's economics, which is also it's mathematical yet inextricably linked with anything to do with resources. So that anyways, then getting back into Nietzsche a little bit, that's what I figured to talk about was Nietzsche today. And so necessarily then that involves disambiguating what Nietzsche writes about from the political and social surrounds that cloud what he was writing about and these sorts of things. Bild and Bildner, so images and the image seer. So understood, Bild and Bildner in their nominal and adjectival forms would come to have overlapping meanings, something which is implied by the German, where Bildner clearly implies build as its root, but lost in the words that translated in English as image and sculptor. So this is the image and the viewer in this sense, who contrives the image in this sense. That the closeness of the relationship between the two German words is retained by the reading, as I have suggested, is confirmed by the etymology of the word plastic, which comes from the Greek plastikos, which in terms derives from the verb plasein, meaning to mold or form. The plastic artist then is literally the form giver, and the image or figure that which is formed. What then is the relationship between image and dream? And here we have the notion of the imagination is, and then the waking dream or the reverie, the lucid dream, and these sorts of things. Die Kunst des Bildners and die unbildlichen Kunst der Musik. Nietzsche wants us to understand the plastic artist as a form giver in the quite literal sense that is under the influence of the Apollonian dream inspiration that the non-imagistic Dionysian music takes form, that is to say, is translated into an image. So it's basically given to Apollo and usually enough Athena for reason, and then Dionysus for the sensational, or the Epicurean and the like. That Bildner should be understood principally as plastic artist, the form giver, is confirmed by reading two further passages. So an interpreter, which needs its own interpretation, and a viewing through a lens, which needs its own lens. Reading Apollo and Dionysus, the interpretation of Apollo offered above is supported by a number of Greek sources. Perhaps the most famous of these sources is Heraclitus is saying that the Lord whose oracle is in Delphi neither declares nor conceals, but gives us signs, semeni, so semantics, the signs, semeni. What Heraclitus refers to as a sign in this fragment is precisely what Nietzsche names as image, a figure that signifies by referring to another figure outside itself, a figure, therefore, that stands in the place of another and that must be read in order to be understood. The sense of a figure as a placeholder is evocatively illustrated by a passage from the Iliad in which Apollo rescues his charge Aeneas by placing him on the battlefield with a figure, a spitting image. It's like a scarecrow or something like that. And then this is more talk about the classics and interpreting the classics and so on. A musician, a lyric poem, the Verbildlichung, kind of like the Verstellung, the image vis-a-vis the saying of the things and the stellation of these things. Verkörperung, the making of bodies of things, the corpor, meaning personification or embodiment. The ecstasis of the Dionysian. So not there's ecstasy and then ecstasis are two kinds of different things. The ecstasis of the Dionysian reveler, this excessive transgression and transformation of the bounds of subjectivity, is bounded with a vision. In this case, the vision of oneself as another, or the letting go, and the usual idea of like social lubricants and these sorts of things, and inhibitions. These sorts of things. More curiously, Nietzsche describes this process of self-projection as the primordial artistic phenomenon. So he's saying something. the künstlerische Erscheinung. So the Erscheinung is a state of being, and Nietzsche in his will to power is expressed in something. Is the idea about the poet? What concerns the origin of music, and so music is a form, and it's translatable and untranslatable in a sense. Ding-an-sich. Okay, so that's a reflection on Kant. This attempt involves difficulties that are quite acute, since we have noted music has a unique status among the arts in that it is able to represent the will, the ding-an-sich, without itself being representative. And so that's in the subtext is kind of is for with regards to things like sensation and epiphany, meaning the eye-opening kind of account of things. That music is that besides the lyrical, also associated with, generally enough, the emotional, and so that it is behind a veil, as it were, or a deep current, as it were, but yet it is something through which people paddle regularly every day. Nietzsche's argument reaches its climax in the following passage. What concerns the origin of music, on the other hand, I have already explained that it can by no means lie in the will, but rather rests in the womb of that power which, under a form of the will, produces a world of vision out of itself. Viel mehr im Schusse jener Kraft ruht, die unter der Form des Willens eine Visionswelt aus sich ersucht. The origin of music lies beyond all individuation, a sentence which, according to our explanation, the Dionysian proves itself. So this is kind of like the idea of the signal as about the line, or the iota, the individual of the individuum of a continuum. The birth of tragedy, rhetoric of persuasion. But the Apollonian and Dionysian, morality as anti-nature. I reduce the principle to a formula. Every naturalism in morality, that is, every healthy morality, is dominated by an instinct of life. Some commandment is filled by a deterministic canon of shalt and shalt not. Some inhibition and hostile element on the path of life is thus removed. Anti-natural morality, that is, almost every morality which has so far been taught, revered, and preached, turns conversely against the instincts of life. It is condemnation of these instincts. So the reciprocity is usually given as grounds for ethics and then morality too, and then whether that's inhibitions or what is it called? That's not the same thing as being anti-life. So this is Nietzsche trying to exhort people that he's like a Calvinist is very frustrated. He's like, I've been told that there was original sin, so all my life I've been evil or something like that, bad. And that's Calvinism, is that men are born with original sin and constantly have to make their life trying to make amends and get absolution and redemption in that tradition. So I don't accept that, really. It's not a sin to be a man, and so people naturally do good or bad things because everything is on the compass of whether it's essentially not adrift in a sea of the amoral, the absent morality. So morals and mores. So mores are kind of like the social rules and expectations and these kinds of things. And then the morals is with regards to the morale and amoral, meaning the moral of a passage or story, the lesson, then has that it's also close to mortal, the idea of would have death penalties in these kinds of things. The moral then is that Nietzsche just in that account is one of his more insane periods, one might say, because as a madman, what came around is that in the course of Nietzsche's writings, he became more and more popular, and then he became more and more outraged too in his writings, and then I don't know what kind of influences he might have had with regards to that, but it was in a world where it wouldn't be surprising if Nietzsche were an addict of sorts and of the heavier drugs or something like that. I don't know. That's not for me to say. Vis-a-vis like what Einstein smoked or what Heidegger ate, or these kinds of accounts of influences and these sorts of things. That Nietzsche did go mad, and quite mad. But as he came around and the end of his life, it was kind of like at the end of Don Quixote. So if you've read Cervantes' Don Quixote, there's two major volumes of it. So the first volume of is kind of a story of, it starts with like his first encounters with his faithful companion, Sancho Panza. And then the second book arises after that had been around, and then also has great stories of like the Barbary Coast and these sorts of things, and especially Quixote's time in the cave, and so he for a while he was lost underground in this cave, but eventually he got kind of dug out and saved by who was kind of a son figure to him. Sancho Panza, and then at the end of Quixote's life, he became lucid. He's like, I know I was a knight, and that I upheld the highest ideals of chivalry, and that was a dream, and these kinds of things. And then he bequeathed all his possessions to Sancho Panza, and for it's where it's not really given an account of. The relation there of Quixote. Then the Nietzsche is kind of like Quixote, is what I'm saying, and it's a gentle sort of image that one way to read image the Quixote though is Quixote was perfectly fulfilling his conscience to be the knight of the sad countenance, or as he so upheld himself. Whereas Nietzsche was kind of tortured too, and then but very popular already, and even in his time. But then at the end of his life, when he started turning stuff around, he says, on further reflection, or it's come back to me that there's been recalled this. Then all of a sudden people started dropping his books because they stopped speaking to them. The accounts of what he'd been saying that people had as speaking to them or speaking for them, or these kinds of things. That Nietzsche was a full circle kind of life. On Warren's account, Nietzsche violates the structures of his own philosophy by applying the concept of will to power to the political realm in an essentializing manner. This occurs, Warren contends, because Nietzsche misunderstands the limits of the will to power. Rather than being the basis for Machiavellian philosophy of power, the will to power provides a framework for a philosophy of human agency that shows how individuality, responsibility, and positive freedom are possible, and that could be developed consistently with the social values of reciprocity, mutual processes of individuation, and equality. In support of this interpretation, Warren argues that Nietzsche's essentializing use of the will to power in its political application violates his own critique of metaphysics, and that in reading Nietzsche, we should distinguish between the metaphysical political uses of the will to power and the critical or non-metaphysical role this concept plays elsewhere in Nietzsche's writings. And so that's where we'd relate Nietzsche kind of to Sartre. And having Sartre as more of a conscientious, a saner variety of Nietzsche for that sort of purpose. Leaving aside the question of whether the will to power can act as a framework for a philosophy of human agency, it remains to be seen whether the strategy of saving Nietzsche from himself in the manner advocated by Warren does not do unnecessary violence to the Nietzschean text. This worry arises out of Warren's own hermeneutic method, which uncritically assumes a rigid distinction between figurative and literal meaning, and more importantly, between language and so-called extra-linguistic entities. Warren defends the second of these two distinctions in the following manner. Texts are appropriate as models of discursive meaning for Nietzsche, and are perhaps even appropriate as models of cognition, but even meanings and cognitions presuppose non-discursive relations to the world, relations of sensuousness, power, limits, and possibilities of the material world, and the like. These are what Nietzsche means to capture in his notion that much of life is made of multifaceted Dionysian qualities. So, where Athena fits between Apollo and Dionysus here for Nietzsche is kind of gone away in a sense. but that's one less variable. Here, that in that sense of the classics is that that's wisdom for you. And so Apollo is the empiricist, sort of the sun rises and sets every day. Dionysus is a crowd of people who pass out from drink every night. But then the Athena is the wise, is the idea. From beyond good and evil. Here's a challenge. Mark Warren, who has passionately argued for the second of these two positions, provides the following commentary to section 259 of Beyond Good and Evil. So Warren says, here's the challenge. Nietzsche explicitly claims that political exploitation can be deduced as necessary to any society from the fact that life is essentially will to power. There's no mistaking Nietzsche's point. Exploitation of one person by another is ontologically rooted in life as such. See, this is part where it's kind of like, I guess that's a little bit closer to the neo-Nietzscheans than otherwise. That's kind of the explanatory factor that people gave for. It's like, well, then this is philosophically sound. But let's see what Warren says. Exploitative social relations can be removed from society only at the expense of, and then he has in quotes, life. But that's just that's self-serving interest, and so Nietzsche's will to power is here. It's taken as more of, it's more than just a survival instinct and greed, and so then Warren continues, since quote life is at the root of value, it follows that political exploitation is both natural and perhaps even desirable. And that's just taking advantage, and there's fair advantage and there's unfair advantage. When Nietzsche elaborates the concept of will to power, he does so metaphysically rather than critically. Let's see, and then those could be reversed in a sense. So there's more to read in Nietzsche, and so maybe I'll just put Nietzsche back on the shelf as having gone quite mad, and not being reliable anymore, except as kind of like a Calvinist is like, well, men are bad, or Spinoza is like men are enemies, and Nietzsche is like the world is my enemy, and these sorts of things that is an anti-Plato in this sense. In a passage belonging to the first chapter of Ecce Homo, but until recently presumed lost, Nietzsche articulates a very different theory of heredity. When I seek my most profound antithesis, the incalculable commonness of instinct, I always find his relatives. All dominant concepts of heredity are, physiologically speaking, nonsense. So he's just got no home, I guess is what he's saying. The eternal basic text, which Nietzsche refers to in section 230, cannot then be understood as something akin to the Kantian thing itself. Oh, it can. Whose qualities and characteristics are entirely independent of human cognitive and linguistic capacities. So Kaufman on Nietzsche on the eternal basic text. That's at least one of the things that this is Nietzsche's later account when he kind of came back to his senses and probably realized the what when he'd been making accounts for people is like, like live your life, it's okay, it's not bad to live your life, and then having people take that to like take other people's lives. That Nietzsche was probably waking up to that. Rousseau, the first passage begins with a characteristically negative description of Rousseau. Rousseau, this typical modern man, idealist and canaille combined in one person, preached the return to nature, but to what did he actually want to go back? I also speak of return to nature, although it is not actually a return back, Zurückkehren, but an advance towards an Aufkommen, the strong, bright, frightful nature and naturalness of men who could play with great tasks, because they would become tired of small ones and feel disgusted. So this has been the hour then. And it's kind of, it gets to that Nietzsche fought himself. Martha Nussbaum has argued that in the Phaedrus, Plato considers the mutual exclusivity of poetry and philosophy argued for on the public, and ends up arguing for conception of philosophy that incorporates poetic mania. So the part of the Dionysian account is that there are multiple perspectives on things, and a monoculture is weak in a sense. Well, good day, gentle readers. Reading Foundations today.